Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of the 30th Annual Georgia Bar Media and Judiciary Conference. We're beginning this morning with a session on the pandemic and Georgia courts, where we are and where we are headed. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, who you'll see on this slide. And now I'd like to turn it over to the organizer, one of the organizers of this panel, Jane Hansen. Jane is the Public Information Officer of the Georgia Supreme Court, a post she assumed after a number of decades as an award-winning reporter for the Atlanta Journal and Constitution. Jane?
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel on Georgia courts and this pandemic. We have a great panel of judges for you this morning who have all been working very hard this past year and shown remarkable leadership in steering our judiciary through the pandemic. If you have questions as they speak, please note them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the discussion, we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. I'd now like to turn it over to our moderator, Chief Judge Susan Edlein of the Fulton County State Court. Judge Edlein.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It is an honor to be here with all of you today, to be here with these fantastic panelists who are truly the leaders for our judiciary during this pandemic. I'm just going to do a very, very brief introduction of each of our panelists. They are probably well known to most of you, and because so we can get started with the questions. Also, we'd like to leave some time at the end. So if you do have questions, please add them, as Jane said, to the Q&A. One of our panelists is Judge Brian Amero, who is the Chief Judge of the Henry County Superior Court. He has served as a judge for about 15 years. And he currently serves as president of the Council of Superior Court Judges. We also have as a panelist, Justice Shawn LaGrua, who has been on the Supreme Court now for 2 months, or coming up on 2 months. But before that, she served over a decade as a Superior Court judge in Fulton County, and was the president of the Council of Superior Court Judges when this pandemic started, I believe, and also served as chair of the COVID-19 task force. And finally, we have Chief Justice Melton, who is Harold Melton, who has served in that role since 2018, and was appointed to the Supreme Court in 2005, and has led the judiciary through this pandemic process. So welcome to all of you. We are happy to have you and here to join us and to share your expertise with us. Chief Justice Melton, I thought that I would start with you. Some of the folks on this panel are listening today to this panel may not be aware of the long history that you have had with pandemic planning for the judiciary in the state of Georgia. But over a decade ago, I believe then Chief Justice Leah Ward Sears appointed you or assigned you the job to come up with a pandemic plan for our state, which I believe you updated in 2018. So maybe you could share with us a bit of that history. What was your take on it back then when you were tasked with this job?
For good or for bad, pandemics and I go back a long way. When I was relatively new on the court, Chief Justice Sears called me into her office. She had mentioned that some leadership from the Atlanta Bar Association had grown concerned about the world of pandemics. And the science was that it's a matter of if, not when, when, not if, in terms of the pandemic. And any smart governing practice would include planning for the impending pandemic. And so she asked me to chair it. And so we put together a commission, great lawyers, great people within the judiciary, and we met with the healthcare experts. And I became convinced that this was an important issue. I was impressed that the chief thought seriously enough about it to act on the need to create a plan. I'm not sure I would have done that if I were in her shoes. But the more we dug into it, the more we realized that this was real, and we were able to put together a bench book that we had sent out to the courts, and we had on the AOC website. So to some extent, we had answers to the questions that we knew to ask. What we did not have were answers to the questions we didn't know we needed to ask. But that was a big help. It was a big help at least getting us going. And when we were in that early stages of reacting to the pandemic, hitting the courthouses and people going to hospitals, it provided a source of comfort that we weren't just thinking up things from scratch. So we had some momentum going into how to answer questions and a framework for how to go into questions. That gave us some degree of comfort going into this.
Thank you. So coming forward to about a year ago, can you describe the process that went into creating the first declaration of the statewide judicial emergency?
Yeah, so when the pandemic started hitting the courts, there was a mild to severe wave of panic that started hitting. And we initially went with a local court approach to responding to the pandemic. And we had a conference call with the judges across the state. And we had the model order out of the bench book presented forward. Fulton County, I believe, was one of the first counties that kind of personalized it to Fulton County, and they sent that around, and courts started entering orders pretty quickly. I think literally within a day or two after that, the governor declared a statewide emergency order. And that very next day, we, the Judiciary, declared a judicial emergency, largely borrowing from what was in the bench book. In a time immediately after that, we formed an internal committee in our court that thought about all the other issues and heard from the Judicial Council and all the issues that they had seen and had questions about, and that the list of issues that got added to the emergency orders started growing pretty quickly. How do you do grand juries? How do you do video conferencing? What are the things we need to emphasize? And then as we started kind of opening up and learn how to operate within the midst of a pandemic, we got the guidance from our task force that Judge LaGrua was so kind enough to chair. And those guidance principles became embedded in the directions for the courts going forward. And so it's been a process of hearing from judges and answering questions and being kind of collective in how we issue each order as we move forward.
Thank you for that. I think that brings us to an opening to speak to Justice LaGrua and the work that you have done as the chair of the Judicial COVID-19 Task Force. I think one of the things that Justice Melton just mentioned was that getting lots of perspectives from judges and other experts and lawyers. And I know one of the things that you did was to bring health experts into that. How important was that to you and to the task force?
When the Chief Justice asked me to take on that opportunity, I'm not sure I knew exactly what I was encountering or what I was going to be doing for the next year. But he had selected an incredible group of attorneys and judges from around the state, both defense attorneys, prosecutors, civil plaintiffs attorneys, civil defense attorneys, judges from every class of court. The one thing, and there were a number of healthcare experts that were also on the original task force. One of the things we didn't have, and I was fortunate thanks to Chief Brasher, when I was still in Fulton County, the chief judge there, he had brought on Dr. Mark Swancutt, who's with the Fulton County Department of Public Health. And when I looked at who we had talking about the issues on the task force, I contacted the chief after looking and asked him if we could add Dr. Swancutt to the task force. And he's been instrumental in guiding us through some of the challenges, the issues, what to expect, how to deal with the Department of Public Health, how to interact with because there are different departments throughout the state. Fulton County has its own Department of Public Health, but there are other local departments of public health. I will tell you that what started as answering a few questions grew over the weeks and months that ensued as the task force continued. I think when the chief originally formed the task force, we thought that come July or August, we'd sort of be back to normal. And now we're past a year, and hopefully normal's in sight at this point, sometime later this year, but we're still not there. I will say that the task force was representative of the best group of collegiate professional attorney relationships I've seen in my entire career. You had attorneys from both sides that worked diligently to come up with solutions that everybody could live with to help us work through this pandemic. There weren't people digging in heels because they had an agenda. And I have to tell you, Judge Edlein, if the practice of law was, if the practice of law would reflect the practice of the task force, lawyers would have a much better reputation in our community, across the state and across the country. And a lot of the specifics you can look at on the AOC website of the things that the task force did. One of the more useful ones as we start back with jury trials and some in-person proceedings is what was probably not perfectly titled the reopening guide, because the courts never really closed. We probably should have thought about that before we published it, but we were thinking as things got started, not so much reopening. And that's a great tool. The only caveat I would give to that is that was created in the early days of the task force, probably in the June, July era, and things have changed. As they've changed in the last few days on vaccines, who the affected classes were changed. So the only caveat I give to that guide is to keep up with the most recent things on the CDC and Department of Public Health websites as they've tweaked things a little bit.
You know, you mentioned, moving forward, but I guess at the time when this hit, you were the president of the Council of Superior Court Judges. In addition to working with this task force, what were some of the most immediate concerns back, when the pandemic began and we started having to, shut down in-person proceedings, yet we still had people who were in custody and emergency issues that had to be dealt with?
That candidly, and Judge Amero will be able to talk to this as well, because he was on the ground with us throughout. But many of the issues you just named remain issues. We have people in custody that need bond hearings, that need preliminary hearings, that need to be present in court. We had, and I think this is good and bad. I think there are a lot of positives and some negatives to this, but I suspect that pandemic has put us a decade ahead of where we might have been on video conferencing and electronic communication and the things we can use it for and how we use it. Personally, I hope we never stay at the level we are and that we get back to in-person proceedings at the appropriate level. But I think we will always use some of these conferencing techniques to make the practice of law more efficient. But we still have, as you know, in Fulton County, we can bring about, I think it's 12 to 15 inmates a day to the courthouse. That's nothing compared to what it used to be. So we're using Zoom for pleas, for hearings. We had to tweak rules 9.1 and 9.2 with the help of the Supreme Court, adjusting those rules so that we could do video conferencing and video hearings. And I think across the board, as a rule, everybody has tried to work together to do things the best way we can through this. Obviously, some of the challenges were in some circuits where folks wanted in-person hearings and we had to tweak how we were going to do that and who would be mandated to do it and what was really necessary for an in-person versus something that could be done versus via one of these video conferencing platforms, be it Zoom or WebEx or whatever we were using.
Thank you for sharing those experiences with us. And Judge Amero, I would like to turn to you and give you and ask you, what are some of the current challenges that we are seeing from your perspective, not only as a trial court judge, but also as the president of the council, and maybe explain the role that the chief judges have in each of the judicial districts in courthouse preparation. You're muted, sir.
You're muted.
And isn't that the first thing that we learned about how this works? Is that you're going to have to say at least 10 times a day, 15 different people, you're on mute. I want to start really small. Today, I began a calendar at 9 o'clock with 40 criminal defendants and their attorneys. And as I walked into the courtroom and sat down, there's a giant video monitor in front of me where I see more than half of the criminal defendants in these little squares, and I see their attorneys. Some of them you see their pictures, some of them you don't. Some of them you see they're on mute, some of them they're not. It can be a little disorienting, as I'm sure that the viewers of this can feel at times when they see similar setups. I look out into the audience and I see that we have some criminal defendants. My first thought is, all right, are they socially distanced? Are they sitting on the plastic? Do we have sanitizer at the table? How about our sheriff's deputies? Are they wearing their masks properly? Is somebody enforcing the fact that the person in the back right doesn't have their mask all the way up over their nose? Who are we going to manage in what order? Well, let's go ahead and turn to the jail. We have a WebEx terminal over at the jail. We have defendants that are being brought into a holding cell, one after the other. They're sanitizing in between the time that we have a COVID outbreak there at present, unfortunately. And so now what we're seeing is the sheriff's deputy being super extra vigilant and cautious to make sure that this is contained. And they're moving people around within the units to contain it. They're bringing them to the WebEx terminal. I'm dealing with them one at a time at the direction of the sheriff's deputies. I guess I'm saying all of this just to give you a picture of what this new world looks like on the ground for me every day. And this is the type of new world that all of our Superior Court judges have had to roll out from the beginning all across the state. And so, Susan, what have we been doing since the beginning of this pandemic as a council? I think is one of the questions. We've been rolling out the technology that we need. I think that there was, when Shawn and I were still working on this together, I believe that there was an agreement that we needed to have a purchase of WebEx licenses. That seems like it was 100 years ago when we first decided to do that. Make them available to all Superior Court judges all across the state. We had to kind of navigate public health guidance at the beginning of this pandemic. What exactly is it that we're supposed to do? That was not at all clear. And if you'll remember at the beginning of this, it was very much politicized. It still is to some extent. Are masks important? Are they not important? What kind of matters can we handle in court? What kind should we consider using this new technology for? There was a very significant, heated debate about whether or not we should have any in-court proceeding at all initially, whether or not masking was preventing us from being able to confront our accusers, whether or not masking was absolutely necessary. What sort of masking? Double masking? Should we have on these clear masks? So there were so many issues. What we didn't want to do was lose our ability to determine the truth from the proceeding that we had in front of us, which I felt was the core piece of this. That's what we do ultimately, is to make sure that our verdicts and our judgments speak the truth. And so we had to keep that in mind very clearly as we moved along while we managed all of these other issues about masking and social distancing and technology and rule changes and emergency orders. And remember, and I'll stop, I promise. We also had to deal with the fact that we had so many disparate actors, all separately elected, all with different positions on where we are and how we need to be doing things. We had to harmonize all of these attitudes and all of these beliefs about how the virus was hitting us, and sort of somehow get everybody moving locally in the same direction so that we could accomplish something. And that was no easy task. So I've given you just sort of an overview of what the beginning was like and what we're doing now, and a little bit about what the council was doing initially, and so grateful for the leadership of Judge LaGrua and Justice LaGrua and Chief Justice Melton. You know, one of the things that I did initially as council president is look and see who we had in what role in leadership and decide how active a role I had to play. And you look around at the bench and you say, hey, these guys are great. Let's try to get our folks to line up with what they're doing and saying. Let's make sure that they all understand what it is that Justice LaGrua and Chief Justice Melton are doing and saying. And so we're trying to, as a council, be of one voice as much as possible and have that voice be Chief Justice Melton's.
And thank you so much for that. And that brings me to a question for the Chief Justice. And I think that what Judge Amero pointed out was that there are so many different actors and so many different classes of court. I mean, you've got the challenges by the appellate courts. You've got on the trial court level, you've got probate courts, you've got municipal courts. You know, there's just such a wide variety. What actions were taken to make sure that there was a unified approach for all of these different levels of courts to the issues and the concerns that have been raised during the pandemic?
So if you would have asked me going into this whether I believed our court system could weather this year-long storm in a cohesive manner, I would have had my doubts. But that is a very real question. I know Peter has seen our work in the IT world, Peter Canfield, where we've tried to navigate the various classes of court, and then add to that we rely on our clerks as well for the operations. And the clerks are independently elected officials. They don't answer to the judges. So what we were able to do was be very, very, very inclusive. We did not exclude anybody that ever wanted to come to any meeting whatsoever. And we heard from everybody, and that was important. And we've been doing that for years. And so I think we had some goodwill going into this crisis based on this inclusiveness. But I think what Judge Amero said is really true. A lot of this depended on the quality of leadership all across the board. Each of those councils that you just named had people in leadership that had no other objective other than to see their court system work and for the entire court system to work. And I don't think that's always the case, but Judge Amero came to me before this and said, you know, when I become president, I want to help you any way I can. Judge LaGrua and I have been friends for a long time. We're team players together. The administrative offices of the courts, AOC, the leadership there is just top notch. The leadership on our court, you know, the internal team that we were able to put together. And so y'all should know that the power that I have as chief, I do have the authority to issue the executive orders. That's true. But beyond that, I've got no authority. And so what I do with our court and with the Judicial Council, which is our governing body, I say please a lot. I say please about 5 times a day. And without exception, the answer has been yes at every turn. And I'm so grateful to the leadership for their ability to cooperate and willingness to cooperate and be problem solvers, because like Judge LaGrua said, Justice LaGrua said, this was a perfect opportunity for everybody to get in a room and get protective about their little sphere of influence, but that didn't happen. And instead they came together in a collective, cooperative manner to try to get us across the finish line. And that's made all the difference.
thank you for sharing that. And I think that the fact that we have, as you pointed out, so many different actors and elected officials and in each of our counties has presented additional challenges that other states may not have, as I'm sure have become very apparent during this.
And let me just add this, on top of that, you have the sheriffs. Judge Amero mentioned the sheriffs. We don't control the sheriffs, but we can call the director of the Sheriff's Association and say, here's a problem we're having. Oh, I'll tell you another problem we had, even on the front end. We tried to shut down courthouses from time to time in various courts. Well, not all your courthouses are judicial. You might have a tax assessor's office in there. You may have the commissioner's office in there. And so even having those conversations about who has control over what space and who has responsibility for what space, all that has been very productive sets of conversations.
Justice LaGrua, maybe you can share, is there anything that particularly surprised you in going through this process? Something that you didn't think you'd be looking at as part of the task force, or was it just kind of walking into it saying everything's on the table? We don't know what we're facing and how and what sort of challenges are going to come before us.
I think it was probably more the latter, that we didn't know where we were headed. We started with, I'm not sure the chief gave us a direct path to go, but he did create an incredible group. And so what we did initially was we divided the task force into the civil group, the criminal group, the juvenile group, the interpreters group, and I may be missing one, but they became subcommittees so they could work on issues that affected those classes of courts specifically. When you have the head of the GTLA and the GDLA speaking, they don't really care about what the prosecutors and the defense attorneys are doing. And I don't mean that in a insensitive way. It just doesn't affect their practice of law. So what we tried to do, and again, we had judges from every class of court that dealt with both civil and criminal. So we tried to divide it up so we could address specific issues on each side of it. Ultimately, when we talked about court starting back up in the more traditional sense, as I said, the chief made sure everybody knew that we were never closed, but we definitely cut back in services and appearances and the things that happened. And as we started to do things, we tried to combine civil and criminal whenever we could. When we talked about best practices in terms of how you handled the courtroom and spacing. But as the chief also noted, we had to work with the sheriff's department on how to control the courthouse, both entry into the courthouse and what safety precautions. Because one of the big things that we've talked about from the beginning of this is the comfort of both practitioners, that is our lawyers, coming into the courthouse when necessary, but also the other folks that had business in the courthouse. How do we make the public comfortable that they are safe, or as safe as you can be in the midst of a pandemic like we've had when they come into the courthouse? So you had to change practices completely. I can speak to many. I practiced across the state at different times, but you have different challenges in different courthouses. You have courthouses in this state that may have one bathroom on a floor. So how do you accommodate folks when they're coming in to make sure that those bathrooms are sanitized? How do you sanitize bins coming in? Do you do temperature checks? Do you do more in-depth screening when you come into the courthouse? So all of those things were things that we tackled. Then we had to tackle what types of hearings could you do remotely versus what type of hearings you could not do remotely. And I will say, and it was funny, I got an email from my mom when the Chief Justice announced that very sadly he would be leaving the court later this year. And she said, I know you're very upset that your boss is leaving. And while he's never expressed that he was the boss, I don't know that technically he's the boss, but I have to tell you, we could not have been better served in this state during this pandemic than to have a leader like Chief Justice Melton. He was even, he was focused, he was patient. I don't think anybody imagines the number of calls he fields from across the state. We tried to tell everybody, let's funnel things as much as we can through this task force so that the chief doesn't get calls from everybody. He still did. He got calls from judges across the state in every class of court. And he handled them with the typical grace and patience that he shows with everyone. And, you know, Judge Amero took over the Council of Superior Court Judges, and Judge McClellan was on the task force, and Judge Bell and Judge Quadra. And I could name all the judges, but it was an incredible group of focused people that, as the chief said, people could have dug in and they didn't. And I think we have found things throughout this process that will survive the pandemic as best practices. They are not going to, they may have come about because of COVID, but they will linger for, I hate to say eternity, who knows what the future holds, but they will linger for many, many years to come. And that's thanks to the great leadership we've had in this state and the cooperation of those on the task force.
Well said. And I think that all of us in this state, whether we are lawyers or judges or just members of the public, we owe a great debt of gratitude to Chief Justice Melton and to you, Justice LaGrua, and everybody else who gave countless hours on top of trying to figure out not only what they're doing in their own individual courts, as Judge Amero has discussed, like what you're faced with. And I think every judge, you know, has been faced with, but just the bigger picture, all those extra hours, your nights and weekend time. So thank you all so much for your selfless leadership during this time. Judge Amero, I wanted to ask you, because part of this is where we're going after this. And I think Justice LaGrua made a great comment. She thinks that we are probably a decade ahead on technology than we would have been otherwise. And personally, I think that is one of the silver linings of this very dark cloud that we have had. But what are some of the things that you see going forward that maybe came about as a result of this pandemic, but that likely will remain with us?
Well, I think we're going to try to get away from the larger calendar calls. I think we've found that we can be very effective with more nuanced calendaring, more targeted calendaring, where we can have fewer people here, have them here only when it's necessary that they be here. I think that really benefits the lawyers who practice before us. It helps everyone. And so this has sort of forced us to move in that direction, and I hope that that continues. That's just one thing. I think that there will be use of technology for pretrial conferences and for matters that don't require a determination of credibility. Those types of matters will be using this technology to continue. I think that for a lot of pretrial matters that involve defendants, we've seen great success with our ability to use the WebEx feature at the local jail and avoid transport. In a lot of places, the courthouse and the jails are not connected to each other, and there's a little bit of liability associated with getting inmates into trucks and bringing the inmates over to the courthouses, and frequently it's just to get an announcement that, you know, the case is continued, or Judge, we're not quite ready for a plea. There's a little bit of investigation that needs to occur here regarding someone's mental health. And so that's all the type of work that can be handled remotely. And I suspect at least 30% of the work that we're doing right now will remain remote. I think that one of the things that we really need to do is really enlist the help of some academics and others to sort of study this and get a sense for what should stay and what should return to normal. And we all, as a group, over the course of the next 5 and 10 years, I'm sure maybe even longer, need to really think through how best to use this technology, these efficiencies, and at the same time, again, as I've said previously, not lose anything that is connected to the truth-seeking process.
One of the things that I have noticed is how, as you mentioned, scheduling issues, but also on the civil arena, how efficient it has been to handle so many calendars via Zoom platform or some other WebEx or some other platform like that. And I certainly am going to keep that as part of my regular practice. You know, at least in the metro area, you've got folks who don't have to sit in traffic and park their car and, you know, get through security and come into the courthouse and all of those issues. Yeah.
I just
Judge
want to
Amero.
add another thing that I really think we need to check in with the litigants, to find out just more broadly how they feel about the way in which this has been handled remotely and whether or not it's been a reasonable substitute for the in-court proceedings.
Well, Judge, let me just add, you know, I know the one thing the litigants will say is if they don't have to get in their car to drive to Savannah from Atlanta for a 15-minute status conference with the judge just to tell them where they are in terms of whether they're ready for trial or not, they would appreciate not having to spend that time and not having to bill their clients for that time.
That's for sure.
I think their clients would probably appreciate that too. So from an appellate side, what do you all see from an appellate side as far as, you know, and maybe you can explain what's been happening for appellate arguments.
So yes, we switched to virtual arguments pretty quickly, and our IT staff has been great. So we have not seen any drop off in the quality of the presentations. We had a couple of glitches for weather and things like that we wouldn't otherwise have anticipated. But we are on top of our workload. We don't have the choice but to be on top of our workload. But I think our direct appeals are down 14% from last year, which is a reflection on the decreased activity at the trial court level. So when the trial courts go live, completely live, our caseload will pick up. In terms of internal operations, we have been involved in circulating documents and drafts electronically since this time. Justice McMillan probably has spent next to no time in her office. 100% of her operation is virtual. Justice LaGrua, I think, is more in person. So we know how to do 100% of what we do electronically. If we decide to keep it that way, we will have a retreat, our annual retreats in April. That'll be one of the things we talk about. Like Judge Amero said, how much of this keep and how much will we go back to the way it was before. But I don't think we'll go back completely to the way we were before.
How do you think it's been with oral arguments being virtual?
It's been fine. You know, I know the lawyers enjoy, I think they're probably less stressed by not having to come to the building. We've had a couple of glitches from time to time, but they're really minor. We have no regrets about having shifted to the virtual platform. It's a question for us how much of that we want to keep, and we very well might keep that as an option. I just don't know the answer to that, but it's been fine. It's been great.
One of the issues, and I know that has been something that you've been addressing in your judicial emergency, orders is a resumption of jury trials. As a trial court judge, as I'm sure for all levels of court, you know, trial courts across the state who have jury trials, it is an overwhelming thought about the backlog. And I know lots and lots of people are doing as much as we possibly can on the front end to make sure those cases that say we are ready for trial, that they are actually ready to go to trial. But, you know, when do we see, from your perspective, jury trial starting back and what that's going to look like? Because I think all of us can say it's not going to be like it used to be.
Right.
That's one thing I think everyone agrees on.
I will tell you that is the biggest, most overwhelming question that I and we face. We know the premium that we have to put on safety. There is a very close premium that we put on the idea that individuals have been locked up in jail in some instances for a year without facing trial, and maybe even longer, and to make peace with. I fully expect that in our next judicial emergency order, which will go out Tuesday, March 9th, that we will open up jury trials again. We have templates in place. We have the work of the task force We have guidelines for how to do that. Those guidelines include instructions, or at least directing the courts to plan for every aspect of what happens on a jury trial. That means where you park, how you walk into the building, how you do temperature checks, how you get to the elevators, how many people ride the elevators, how you get to wherever you go, what kind of directional signage, where you sit, mask, you name it. Every aspect of what happens during that day is accounted for. And we've directed our courts to come up with those plans, but also to push those plans out to the public, so that when someone who's sitting on their couch receives a summons to come be a juror, they can go on the court website and see that the court has planned for their safety. They shouldn't have to get in their car and wonder what it's going to be like. So we have plans in place, and we're going to be making a push for jurors in particular to come out and serve, because it is absolutely critical in our society that people be willing to serve and of all this pandemic we've had, and sitting on a jury should not be something that we need to be our fuss about afterwards.
So much for that. And
I started prior to the pandemic with a calendar of a criminal jury trial calendar of 80 people. We took stock recently, and now I have about 315 people on that calendar. We have another 200 cases that are awaiting grand jury indictment. I'm going to get my third of that. We're going to be up about 400 for my calendar, which means that we're at 5 times the number of cases on my criminal calendar that we were back in January of 2020. And of course, we're concerned about speedy trial demands. What happens if all of the newly indicted cases just before the emergency began and now since grand juries have been allowed to operate, indicted cases to get for a couple years or more, where they didn't feel like they needed. And on top of that, we have a reduced capacity to try the cases, because now, because of social distancing, in my courthouse, where we have 4 courtrooms, we can really only try, according to the DPH guidelines, 1 case per trial week. So we're going to be resolving these cases more slowly than we did previously. All of these are concerns at present. And does that get to the nub of your question?
absolutely. Thank you for sharing those. Justice LaGrua, what do you see as some of the challenges going forward?
Thanks for that. We've been very rosy during this panel about all the things that we've accomplished in the last year, and I think we really have. But I think everybody needs to be mindful that we have a very long road ahead that are going to present many, many, many more challenges. As Judge Amero points out, even with the chief indicating that we're going to pick up with jury trials going forward, they are not going to look the same as they did. I can talk about many courthouses. I was in the Fulton County Courthouse for 10 years. We have in the entire courthouse for 30 judges, if you count state and superior court, 2 courtrooms that have the ability right now to pick a jury. We used to have sometimes 15 plus juries going during 1 week. Now we might have 1 at a time. That's with the backlog. As Judge Amero points out, you're going to have speedy trial demands. And I think ultimately there's going to be some legislative support to address that. It's not going to do away, I don't think, with the issue long-term completely. But in addition, and I know many of the participants on this in this segment are probably not criminal practitioners. You probably have a lot of civil practitioners. And one of the things that the task force has spent a lot of time talking about is what happens to the civil cases, because candidly, in particular in Superior Court, as you know, and you can comment on this better than I can, but in state court, you try criminal cases, but not a significant number, and they don't take very long. In Superior Court, we try probably 80+% of our trials are criminal trials, and they take much longer than a state court trial. So we're going to have to address the backlog on the criminal side often before we can get to the civil side. That doesn't mean that the civil cases aren't important and that we don't recognize that the civil practitioners need to get into court, and their clients, they have parties that have vested interests. And that's one of the things the task force has talked about, is how to get judges more involved in helping civil attorneys move some of their issues and cases in the pandemic. One of the things that we've suggested is that civil practitioners in particular be in touch with the judges in their cases, see if there are things that can be done to move things, resolve them, back up criminal cases, consider whether they're willing to do remote proceedings, be it remote jury selections, ultimately remote trials that have been done across the country, some very successfully. In fact, most more successfully than unsuccessfully, I think. But I think we're a number of years, even once we start, from being able to address the backlog, in particular on criminal, and then the civil is going to back up more as we try and address the criminal. So while I think a lot has been done in the last year that's been great, I just hope that the bar and actually the members of the task force, and I've talked to the chief a little bit about this, have asked to stay together for the long term, not hopefully meeting as often or having as much work, because we have other jobs as well, but so that as challenges arise, as we move forward coming out of the pandemic, we have a group to at least bring those challenges to the attention of the Chief Justice, the bar, and other folks. So while I think a lot has been done and it's rosy, there's not a perfect field going forward. We're gonna continue to have challenges, and I hope that people will continue to communicate about those challenges and the solutions from around the state.
Yeah. In addition, I know you mentioned that superior courts are addressing, and you've got what 80% of your trials you're estimating are probably the criminal. But also, one concern I know is the increase in domestic violence during all this. And so the superior courts are also dealing with issues of the family law cases and those kinds of cases too. And so what are the actions that you all have taken with regard to those during this pandemic? As far as
we've addressed some of the hearings that can be done remotely. Candidly, I'm gonna be quite honest about this. I was fortunate or unfortunate to be a Fulton County judge where we have a family division that I was never assigned to. So if you don't mind, I'm going to let Judge Amero handle a little bit of that, because I know he's very involved in the domestic field, and I don't want to talk about things that I'm less versed in than someone else on this panel.
Okay.
Well, what's interesting about the domestic side, what you're saying is true. We are seeing an uptick in domestic violence cases. And I think that it's in part due to the fact that divorces were not necessarily seen as essential initially. Sometimes people would try to get their cases resolved through the TPO process that would perhaps have otherwise been resolved by way of temporary orders and final hearings. And
And let me just jump in. The TPO process, or the temporary protective orders, just for folks who may not be as familiar with the lingo.
That's correct. But we have made a commitment to making sure that the TPO process was the first process that was equipped with the video technology. We wanted to make sure that that was as uninterrupted as it could be. And we've added several additional TPO calendars here in Henry County to adjust to to the volume and to assess the size and the scope of the threats that are out there that are potentially pandemic related. It's not just due to reduced court operations initially and at times throughout the course of this last 12 months. It's also due to the fact that the pandemic is hard on people. We have people who are depressed and upset and losing income and being forced to live in the same space as another person. Perhaps they're a little spend more time with people that they already had a difficult relationship with. It's really a combination of factors, I think, that's led to an uptick there. And our commitment to reducing domestic violence in the community is right at the very top of the priority list, and it's full and complete. But I will tell you that what we're finding on the domestic side in court is that we're able to have in-person hearings because there's not as many actors involved in a domestic bench trial. We're finding a surprisingly large number of people that want to volunteer to come into court and submit to the social distancing and the masking, whatever risk might be connected to that, because they seem to recognize that those cases require that sort of very nuanced, careful evaluation of credibility and truth seeking, and you need to talk to the kids in person. So we have found that the family law section here locally to be very brave and courageous and willing to try all of the new technologies and to come into court to be the first adopters of this new court in-person environment. So that's sort of a general response to your question. If there's anything else specifically that you are interested in or concerned about, please let me know.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think we did address that. I think
Judge
Justice
Edlein,
LaGrua has a.
Could I
Sure.
add one quick thing? One of the things, again, with the chief's consent, we added a couple of family law practitioners to the task force, and they did a great job. And again, this information's on the AOC website on the task force tab, where you find the information of outlining some of the challenges and answers to how to deal with domestic cases. You have some challenges that you don't have in other cases about confidentiality with Zoom hearings and things. You often have to live stream because they have to be public. There are some things that the family bar has done that there are answers to on the website in line with those practices. Just wanted to throw that in for you.
And let me just add too, that was a concern from day one. You asked about the first executive judicial emergency order. And when Justice LaGrua says we did not shut down, we did not shut down. We said there are certain critical, essential functions that have to be maintained. This domestic violence scenario was example one of the kind of work that has to keep going even in the midst of a pandemic.
Thank you. We are coming up in the last few moments of our panel. I think that I could hear from you all for hours. There's so many different things to talk about. I don't see any questions in the chat box, so I'm just gonna give each of you, ask you to, in a couple minutes, to give your final thoughts or what you see going forward, anything that you'd like to add that you haven't had a chance to talk about yet. Judge Amero, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to be here with you today. Susan, I also want to thank Jane and the organizers of this event. I'm grateful for the opportunity just to share my appreciation for all of my colleagues on the Superior Court bench. We have an executive council that has had to wrestle through, which we didn't talk about, significant budgetary issues that were related to the pandemic. You know, when you're being told that the state is going to have a shortfall of over $500 million, and you're going to have to cut your budget 14%, and most of your budget is personnel, and you need all of your people in order to be able to manage this pandemic and to deal with this backlog. It was a time where a lot of people could have just become very fractured. And as a group, we held together. As a group, we supported each other. We've been really good, I think, at communicating and sharing ways to go forward. and deal with the issues that are in front of us without allowing these lack of resources to really cripple us. And we've had support from the Supreme Court, support from all of our other colleagues in the other classes of court, and it's such a good collegial group. Just like the COVID-19 task force, we've met more than 30 times, I think, Chief Justice Melton, on an emergency basis to try to work through all of these issues. And again, I want to just emphasize what Justice LaGrua said, the professionalism, the collegiality, the willingness to solve problems and not become negative. It's really been impressive to me. And I'm inspired by that.
Thank you. Justice LaGrua?
I would tack on to Judge Amero's comments. The thing I would say, and it's in actually the emergency order, sadly, is that I encourage attorneys to remember that we're in the practice of law for a reason. And while we may have differences of opinion, we can agree to disagree. But as the task force has done, and as Judge Amero has said, if we look for solutions that we can live with in a very difficult time to move things forward, we will be better for it. The clients will be better for it. The parties will be better for it. And on a note of levity in one way, but sadly in another, as Judge Amero says, it's been a challenging time. I think one of the things we're going to see as we come out of this is that our poor animals, for many, are going to have a huge separation anxiety as folks start going back to work and leaving their four-legged friends at home alone again. So thanks again for having me on. I appreciate all the support.
Thank you. Chief Justice Melton, I'll give you the last word.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for putting this together. It's very important. You are hearing about the things that we are all proud of. However, I do think it's safe to say that we're not celebrating. We're trying to benefit from the lessons that we've learned. There's still some people who are really impacted by this. And the folks who have been sitting in jail are first and foremost in our minds on this. So we do have work to do. We're not done. We have to finish the drill. We have to get across the finish line. We can't get lazy. Even as our numbers improve, as we open up jury trials, we have to maintain good practices, do it right for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is to make sure that when jurors come to court, that all jurors will feel safe, not just the ones that are safe, but the ones who are just a little bit concerned more than anybody else. And we're going to need everybody's help to provide the assurances and the examples for people to see that this is a safe place to do really critical, constitutionally required work. And we'll need everybody's help involved in this meeting to get the word out that this is really important for us to do.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists, Judge Amero and Justice LaGrua and Chief Justice Melton. Thanks to Jane Hansen for helping to organize this panel and put it together. As you all said, there's been a ton of work going into it, but there are still many, many challenges ahead of us. And I appreciate all of your individual attention to it and from so many other people. So thank you so much. That concludes our panel. I think I'm going to turn it over now to Peter Canfield.
Thank you, Chief Judge Edlein, and thanks to all our panelists for a very informative and also very sobering discussion. Again, we appreciate you all being here for it. The conference continues with our next session at 1 o'clock this afternoon, Meeting the Moment, Racial Justice, Law Enforcement, and the Right to Protest. We have a terrific lineup set for that, and we hope you will all join us back then. Thank you, and see you at 1 o'clock.